Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome back to Rocky Mountain Readings, where we've been reading a beautiful book, Rabbi Akiva, Sage of the Talmud by Barry W. Holtz. Interesting, he's tried to formulate a biography about Rabbi Akiva based on what actually lists or exists, and so it's interesting in that respect, but it's definitely more academic than rabbinic insight. Pretty interesting. So let's continue where we left off. I normally don't like to end off on middle of a chapter, but it happens quite often. Nonetheless, let's continue where we left off on Wednesday. You'll have to bear with me. I have a terrible cold, and I haven't had one in a few years, so I thought, okay, let's choke through this and make this happen because we want to get through the book. I like to finish what I start, but let's back it up a little bit so we can refresh ourselves. We're talking about Rabbi Akiva's marriage and his time away in yeshiva. He spent 24 years, and his wife had a falling out with her father. And at the end of 24 years, his father-in-law kind of changes his heart towards him. And so let's back this up. This understanding is confirmed by the gesture that Kalba Savua makes, falling on his face and kissing Akiva's feet, a sign of ultimate respect in the ancient world. More importantly, this act mimics what Akiva's wife did upon greeting Akiva. She, the one who has always truly known Akiva, makes the gesture that her father imitates, indicating that he too has moved towards understanding the greatness of the man who married his daughter. On top of that, Shalom, Sheila. On top of that, something else has dramatically changed. Through his father-in-law, Akiva has now become a wealthy man. Kalba Savua gives him half his wealth. And with that, the story of Akiva's wife comes to an end. She essentially drops out of rabbinic literature. We have the stories of her meeting and marrying Akiva, of her welcoming him back after 12 and then 24 years, and of Rabbi Gamaliel's wife being jealous of her jewelry. There are some stories about the couple's children, but virtually none about her aside from these. This is curious, particularly after the importance of her role in the formation of Akiva as a scholar. Definitely takes a good woman to be behind a good man to achieve potential greatness, for sure. But perhaps we are meant to understand that the spotlight now shifts to him. His world is the world of his colleagues in the early period of rabbinic Judaism. In the next chapter, we explore those relationships, but before we move on, there is one strange coda to our story, the tale of Akiva's other wife. There are two places in the Babylonian Talmud in which Akiva is said to have married a second time. Clearly, this must have taken place after the death of his wife. Polygamy was not expressly forbidden by Judaic law in rabbinic times, but monogamy seems to have been the norm. Although, as I've said, there is no reference to her dying in any other stories. Nonetheless, the surprising thing about Akiva's second marriage is the woman whom he married. The story about this possible second marriage is told obliquely, as if by hints. The first instance comes in a discussion of an issue mentioned above, the fact that Akiva was said to have become wealthy later in his life, and rabbinic literature is interested in the sources of that wealth. The most obvious one is through Kalba Savua, as we have been seeing. But along with that answer, 5 other options are also given in the discussion. Some quite fanciful, such as Akiva finding a trunk filled with coins that had washed up on a shore from a shipwreck, or returning a missing hoard of treasure to a Roman matron who rewarded him for his honesty. But the most surprising of all these is that he became wealthy by marrying the former wife of Turnus Rufus, the Roman governor of Judea. This bombshell appears without any further clarification in Tractate Nedarim 50a and b. In a different tractate, however, we learn a bit more about this bizarre tale. The story appears in the midst of a discussion about whether a Jew is allowed to praise the beauty of a pagan woman. One rabbi says that it is not allowed. How can we praise a person who worships idols? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel, however, is reported to have seen a pagan woman who was particularly beautiful and exclaimed, "How manifold are your works, O God," quoting from Psalm 104:24. The Talmud continues with another example of the connection between a pagan woman and a noted rabbi. Likewise, when Rabbi Akiva saw the wife of the wicked Turnus Rufus, he spat, then laughed, and then he wept. He spat because of her originating from a putrid drop. He laughed because he understood that in the future she would convert to Judaism and would become his wife. He wept because he understood that such beauty would eventually decay to dust. That's from Avodah Zarah, Idol Worship 20a. The interpretation of Akiva's three actions, spitting, laughing, and weeping, is given by the anonymous narrator of the Talmud. The reader is struck by two aspects of this story. First, that it is told in the context of a discussion about a beautiful pagan woman, and second, that Akiva laughs when thinking of his future marriage to this particular pagan woman, the wife of his adversary. In addition, Turnus Rufus is not only an enemy of the Jewish people, he has a particular antagonism towards Akiva. Turnus Rufus is the Hebrew name in rabbinic sources, sometimes spelled as one word, Turnus Rufus, for the real-life figure, Teneus Rufus, who ruled briefly at the beginning of the Bar Kokhba War 132. See Chapter 7. It appears he was not particularly successful in putting down the Jewish revolt and was replaced soon afterward. There is not a great deal of reliable historical information about Teneus Rufus, but in rabbinic literature, Turnus Rufus is seen as an evil character responsible for Roman decrees that the Jews found particularly odious. In a number of places in the Talmud, he is shown engaging in debates with Akiva about matters of Jewish law and theology, in which Akiva constantly defeats him. In Chapter 7, we will see his role as the villain in one version of the story of Akiva's death. Aside from these two references, the Talmud gives no further details about this surprising episode of Akiva's marriage to Turnus Rufus's wife, but hundreds of years later, the 14th century commentator Rabbi Nisim of Gerona, in his commentary on Tractate Nedarim, filled in the details of the story from his own imagination. Shalom, swords for plowshares? Rabbi Akiva would debate Turnus Rufus in front of Caesar and would always triumph. One time Turnus Rufus came home in an angry, foul mood. His wife asked him, "Why is your face so angry?" He replied to her, "Because of Rabbi Akiva, who is defeating me every day in these debates." She said to him, "Their God hates sexual licentiousness. Give me your permission, and I will cause him to fall into sin." He gave his permission, and she adorned herself and went to Rabbi Akiva. When he saw her, Akiva spat, laughed, and cried. "What do these three things mean?" she asked. Akiva replied, "I will now explain two of them, but the third I will not. I spat because I know that you are originated from a putrid drop. I cried because I understand that your beauty will eventually decay to dust." He laughed because he saw through prophetic vision that in the future she would convert to Judaism and would become his wife, but he did not want to let her know that. She asked him, "Is there any way for me to repent?" "Yes," he answered her. So he went and converted her to Judaism. He married her, and she brought great wealth into the marriage. Obviously, Rabbi Nisim has taken the actions of Akiva from Tractate Avodah Zarah and built upon them for his commentary on Tractate Nedarim. Instead of being the words of the anonymous narrator, at least some of the words are transferred into Akiva's own voice. Of course, quite a bit is left unclear. He tells her to convert, and in the next sentence we read that Akiva is marrying her. And what happens to Turnus Rufus? Rabbi Nisim is not interested in filling in the story. Yeah, Dan Smith, we read one book called The Talmud, a biography, and excellent historical background on the formation of the Talmud. Basically, the one in Babylon, when after the Roman destruction, you had the people eventually move out of the area, and they gathered in Babylon, and a lot of the scholars in a yeshiva there started to debate, and eventually it started to get recorded. But that book, a biography, the Talmud, a biography, really gave us a great understanding of the background behind what led to each event and how it formulated and how it was attacked and burned by the Christians. And it gave us the premises behind the debates and the arguments. But one thing I've been reading of lately that really opened my eyes is why they debated so much in these Talmudic discussions is, I believe it's Hosea chapter 10, verse, I think it's 2, where Hashem does not like a divided heart. And from their understanding, the rabbi's understanding, a divided heart has to do with a dispute within oneself, which causes anxiety and wickedness in this world. And the solution for making the heart whole has to do with suppressing that dispute. And so the arguments that went on in the formation of the Talmud were to really help people understand the what's it called? The code of conduct behind the scenes of the rulings, because that's the solution for a divided heart, or the solution for the disputes within oneself. Because when people are causing all kinds of havoc in the world, it's usually because of a couple of reasons. It's either a dispute in the heart, which is a divided heart, and they don't stand before Hashem. Their actions always end up in the side of the evil actions. If it's not from a divided heart, it's usually from a concealment of sorts. And the sad thing about a concealment, the way Rabbi Nachman Breslov describes it, is a concealment is when a person continuously sins and nothing happens. They seem to think that it's permissible, and that's known as a concealment. When somebody crosses that line of thinking something that's sinful and they think it's permissible, that's a concealment. But then he goes on to describe a concealment within a concealment, and the notion of what that constitutes when people don't even realize that they've made that error, and it's a concealment within a concealment. That comes from disputes within the heart and unsettled matters. And so the Talmudic discussions were there to resolve, because the answers are always found in the code of conduct, or in a mishpatim, the code behind the resolution of any disputes. And when people come to grips with the concept of a dispute, even within their own heart, when the questions aren't answered, it comes down to the very, very fine lines of what Hashem demarks as intelligible to the human intellect, or what he does not allow to be intelligible to the human intellect. Because definition of terms, if people have bad definitions of terms, they tend to justify to themselves negative actions that are in fact causing problems, and that rises up into disputes. And so the Talmud is a very essential work in the sense that it's got that breath of life to resolve internal disputes. And this is why they study, if you want to call it law, but it's code of conduct, mishpatim, code of conduct underneath why they do what they do. And when you get that in your mind, all of a sudden, disputes, it brings that real shalom. And Rabbi Nachman really describes the transliterations in the Hebrew, where they're following the Hebrew letters, and the way they describe it as when a person misunderstands a word and develops an incorrect concept, it's actually a rearranging of the words that Hashem has put into creation, and the solution is always to rearrange them back into their proper definitions so that it makes clear sense. And that's how disputes are resolved and true peace comes. So it's the concept in Judaism is just profound at the effective level in human function. So also the way the negatives attach to the reality, just profound notions that just blow the mind if you've ever been involved in any social interactions that go sour. You can notice things that you don't see any other way, but the answers are all there in the rabbinical understanding and how they make things whole. It's just beautiful. Anyways, obviously, Rabbeinu Nissim has taken the actions of Akiva from Tractate Avodah Zarah and built upon them for his commentary on Tractate Nedarim. Instead of being the words of the anonymous narrator, at least some of the words are transferred into Akiva's own voice. Of course, quite a bit is left unclear. He tells her to convert, and in the next sentence we read that Akiva is marrying her and what happens to Turnus Rufus. Rabbeinu Nissim is not interested in filling in the story. He simply wants to clarify the background to this surprising incident of Akiva's life. We well might wonder where this story of a failed seduction came from. Once again, it is familiar folk tradition that one can find in many cultures. It is even possible that there was such an oral tradition about the story of Akiva and Turnus Rufus. Well, you got to realize, too, that the Talmud is not just one person's writing. It's numerous debates amongst numerous students in the yeshiva. But what about? But what about? But what about? And if you've ever had to argue with a lot of people, that's usually always, but what about? And they need resolution on certain questions, and so the Talmud arguments or disputes were background, but they were put forth by students of the rabbis, and the great debates that they held in developing the Talmud really came from many anonymous sources. Students of great rabbis, but they basically the Tanaim to the Amorim, they've got a whole load of time periods in which it was. But your previous comment, Dan, about that time frame, I don't think it was finally revealed to the public until about the 6th century, but it was, the debates ended in the early 5th century, like you've noted on the time chart. But that book, the Talmud, a biography, really went through the details, and I enjoyed that. So let's continue. It is even possible that there was such an oral tradition about the story of Akiva and Turnus Rufus, and Nissim was simply writing it down, or this may be the fruit of his own imagination, bolstered by the Talmudic report of Akiva spitting, laughing, and crying. No matter what its origins, the incident of Akiva, Turnus Rufus, and Rufus's wife is fascinating, and clearly Rabbeinu Nissim found it so as well. Of course, it's hard to imagine that debates between Akiva and Turnus Rufus actually took place, but the fact that the editors of the Babylonian Talmud chose to imagine this confrontation is significant in its own way, unrelated to historical facts. The battle between the Roman governor and the Jewish sage symbolizes the battle of cultures, pagan and Jewish. Not only does Akiva consistently outwit his enemy, he ends up marrying Forgive me, folks. I took some cough medicine before the class here, and waiting for it to kick in. Forgive me. I got this cold the other day, and nonetheless, let's keep going. Through the story of Akiva's wife, we have seen how he went off to study Torah. But what happened to Akiva during those 40 or 24 years of study? How did he become a great man of Torah? And how did his colleagues relate to him? And now turn to Akiva's life among his fellow rabbis. Yeah, and I think my Rabbi Goldberg yesterday mentioned a comment. I mean, we got to understand that this is the end of the first century, dawn of the second century, and there's a bottleneck with Akiva's life. Akiva's students were wiped out at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, probably around Turnus Rufus's time. But then after that, Akiva shared with 6 express students after that. And those 6 express students became the foundational sages that all rabbis today are linked to in that chain that goes all the way back to Moses. Anyways, the growth of a scholar. 12,000 students, 24,000 students. What are we to make of the number of disciples that Akiva is said to have acquired in the days before he returned home to his wife? Of course, 24 years is a long time. Still, it is not credible that even the most energetic teacher is likely to accumulate so many students, at least before the invention of the internet. In the matter of numbers, we are compelled to grant ancient texts and not only Jewish sources an exemption for what we might call hyperbolic license. So in the case of Akiva, the number of students should not be taken literally, but as a way to express in figurative language his enormous influence. Yeah, I hope I get over this cold soon. Thanks for the kind words. The number 12 and its multiples is not an accidental choice, for it is a number of great symbolic resonance throughout the Bible. The number 120, Moses' lifespan according to the Bible, or 12,000 or 24,000, is meant not only to say a large number of years of students, but to connote something else, namely fullness and completion. The 12 months of the Jewish calendar, the 12 sons of Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel are all signs of the sense of wholeness associated with this number. What remains unclear, of course, is how Akiva moved from the ignorance first attributed to him to such later prominence. No matter which story of origin we explore, the 40-year-old studying with his son or the young married man going off to learn at the urging of his wife, Akiva begins with little and attains greatness. Is there any way to see his growth as a scholar? Unfortunately, rabbinic sources do not give us an easy time on matters of chronology. We have no compact birth-to-death narratives of rabbinic figures, and sources often are at odds with one another. We have similar difficulty in many cases with matters of geography. Trying to place Akiva's life on a map is not a simple task. It is virtually impossible. In other words, to say that when Akiva was such and such an age, he lived in such and such a town, the paucity of information about both chronology and geography works against us. But we do have hints and fragments that offer some insight into Akiva's journey as a scholar, at least the way that tradition framed that journey in the accounts told in the Talmud and other sources. We have seen both in the Talmud and in a vote to Rabbi Nathan that Rabbi Akiva went to study with Rabbi Joshua ben Hanina and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. These two names appear consistently as Akiva's teachers. Tradition identifies Eliezer and Joshua as 2 of the 5 key disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the leading figure in the beginnings of what came to be Rabbinic Judaism. It was Yochanan, according to rabbinic texts, who preached against the resistance to Rome during the first revolt of 66 to 70 CE. Trapped within the walled city of Jerusalem, Yochanan escaped, as told in one of the greatest stories of all rabbinic literature, by posing as a dead body carried out of the city in a coffin. A number of different versions of the story are told in the rabbinic canon, but the main point in each is that the coffin was brought to Vespasian, the Roman general besieging the city, and Yochanan foretold that Vespasian would become emperor of Rome. Vespasian granted Yochanan a wish in gratitude for his prediction, and in the Talmud's version in Tractate Gittin, Decrees of Divorce 56a and b, Yochanan asks, "Give me Yavne and its sages, and the lineage of Rabbi Gamaliel, and a doctor to heal Rabbi Zadok." Yeah, this is where they moved to Yavne. Essentially, Rabbi Yochanan asks to go to a place, Yavne, or Jamina, a city near the coast, not far from Jaffa, modern Tel Aviv, to create a center for Jewish learning and a place where the Gamaliel family and its hereditary line can continue to lead the Jewish people. Academic scholars, starting back in the late 50s, have cast considerable doubt on the historicity of this tale for a variety of reasons, and have come to view it less as history and more as an ideological statement about the formation period of Rabbinic Judaism. As one historian put it, the story serves as a kind of foundation myth for the post-temple patriarchal and rabbinical statement. Yeah, because let's face it, when the temple was destroyed, it was the end of the commonwealth of Judaism, so their entire structure as a commonwealth was altered, and you had, the Sadducees were gone by that period. The Essenes, were wiped out, and the Pharisees, which became, according to rabbinic tradition, became the rabbis. This is the background of their story. The patriarch, Nasi in Hebrew, was given to the more or less official leader of the Jews in Palestine, and the role was considered a matter of dynastic succession. Hillel was perhaps the earliest figure associated with the title, at the end of the 1st century BCE. His successor included Rabbi Gamaliel the Elder, also known as Rabbi Gamaliel, Hillel's grandson, who even gets a mention in the New Testament, and Gamaliel the Elder's grandson, Rabbi Gamaliel II, who plays a role, as we will see, in some of the important stories about Akiva. The actual historical role of the patriarch in these early times is extremely hazy. Many years later, probably beginning around the 3rd century, the position was invested with considerable authority thanks to recognition by the Roman rulers, and historians tend to view the traditions about the earlier figures as modes of validating the realities of the latter sources by establishing a link to the distant past. But the notion of dual strands of leadership, Torah learning was a dynastic status. That it found in the legend of Yochanan's request to Vespasian is one of the story's important messages. In addition, the sheer power of the symbolism of Yochanan arising out of a coffin attest to the rabbis' view that Judaism arose out of the horrible destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Thanks to the efforts that were undertaken by the scholars at Yavne, that's clear in Jewish history. I love how my rabbi yesterday in our Genesis class, you can see it in yesterday's broadcast video, where he shared a little bit about Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the righteous, who greeted Alexander the Great, and this was after the establishment of the Second Temple, who was one of the last of the great members of the Great Assembly. The point being, you kind of get a texture feel of this establishment, similar, as far as the Jewish outlook, how do we continue to survive? What do we look for? And how are we going to go about it? So it took the great sages, the leaders, to, sit down and discuss these matters. And the transition from the Pharisaic, temple-oriented view to the post-temple outlook The earlier sages, the members of the Great Assembly, had actually instituted prayers and all kinds of things because they foresaw a long exile coming, and so at least they had traditions, and this is where you get like Pirkei Avos, the ethics of the fathers. You can track the rabbinical scholars from the beginning, all post First Temple into the dawn of the Second Temple, and the story of Ezra and Nehemiah are really profound for understanding Jewish religious foundations. And archaeologically, you don't have the dawn. If you check the archaeological record, you don't have the dawn of synagogues until about the 3rd century BC. That's the oldest archaeological evidence, is only 3rd century BC. But prior to the destruction of the First Temple, they have clear records that they did not have arguments or debates because of the way the system of society, the functioned. You had the prophets that if people had a dispute, they would go to their leaders, and the leaders would make rulings, and they would follow them, whether to the left or to the right, and that was the way it was. You didn't argue, the ruling came down, and they didn't have disputes, so there was no need to write them. They didn't exist, right? People had them resolved. But the spreading of wickedness, if you want to call it that, happens when things are left unresolved, and you get individuals who get tunnel vision, and they only demand resolution their way, and they're obviously missing something, because that's the heart of tyranny. Nonetheless, the messages was this: the Jewish people would survive because of the enterprise of study and the linkage to the leaders of the past. That's what the rabbis decided after the destruction of the Second Temple. There is also another connection of the coffin story to Akiva. How does this coffin get smuggled out of the besieged Jerusalem? 2 men carry it out, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Rabbi Yashua ben Hanina, Akiva's teachers. In other words, are his direct link to Yochanan. Akiva's connection through his own teachers Forgive me, folks, yes. Akiva's teachers, in other words, are his direct link to Yochanan. Akiva's connection through his own teachers to Rabbi Yochanan is important in establishing his credentials as a sage. In chapter 2, we saw the moment in which Akiva told his students how in his youth he was so antagonistic to the scholars that he wished he could bite them like a donkey. There is another text in which Akiva similarly looks back on his early days as a student. It appears both in the Jerusalem Talmud and in one of the so-called minor tractates of the Babylonian Talmud. This is the version in the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Akiva said, "This was the beginning of my service to the sages. I got up early one morning and came upon a person who had been killed. I carried this body for about 6,000 cubits, a little less than 2 miles, until I brought it to a cemetery and buried him there. When I came before the sages," the version in the Jerusalem Talmud specifically states that he came before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yashua, and with great excitement told them what had happened. They said to me, "Every step you took is counted as a sin against you, and if you had shed blood," I applied the principle of Calva Homer and said to myself, "If at a time when I intended to do something that would count toward my merit, I have sinned in a case where I intended to do less, how much more, the more would I have sinned?" Whenever people reminded Rabbi Akiva of this incident, he would say, "That was how I began to gain merit." That's from Shemahot Morning 419. Forgive me. The version in the Jerusalem Talmud, Nazir, the Nazarite 7:1, adds the coda, "From that moment on, I always continued to serve the sages." Let us unpack what goes on from here and what What lesson Akiva takes away from this particular incident? The context of the story in Tractate Semachot is a discussion about the obligations of a Kohanim, the hereditary category of priests, in connection with the dead bodies. The priest's main function had to do with the practice of temple sacrifice, and because of the specialized nature of their connection to the sacred, they were forbidden by strictures already found in the Bible, for example, Leviticus 21, to come in contact with dead bodies, except for those of their closest relatives, in order not to damage the ritual purity of their vocation. Even today, religious Jews who are descendants of the priestly class avoid attending funerals for those who are not close relatives, and Kohanim are buried in a separate section of Jewish cemeteries. Interestingly, an exception is made for a priest coming upon an abandoned body. Tractate Semachot states, if a priest finds an abandoned corpse, he must attend to its needs. The Talmud then goes on to discuss the category of an abandoned corpse. What constitutes abandonment, and what are the obligations of both priests and others in regard to such a body? The main thrust of the argument is that, generally speaking, a corpse that fits the category abandoned must be buried immediately where it is found. It is at this moment in the tractate that we read the story of Akiva's remembering his past behavior. Akiva is beginning his life as a scholar, and he happens upon a corpse. Tractate Semachot describes the body was as killed. It was killed during war. By accident or murder, we don't know, and no further backstory is given. The version in the Jerusalem Talmud uses instead the technical term for abandoned body, the mitzvah. And it is clear by context that Tractate Semachot also intends us to understand that this slain person fits into the category of an abandoned body. Clearly, Akiva knows nothing about the abandoned body category and requirement about its immediate burial. He sees a body and does what appears on the surface to be a moral, perhaps even heroic act. He carries the remains to a cemetery for proper burial, and it is equally clear that he believes that he has done something exceptionally good. He is exalted to tell his teachers about the act of kindness he performed for this anonymous person. But when he tells them, instead of receiving praise and encouragement, he hears a strong rebuke. Every step you took is accounted as a sin against you, as if you had shed blood. Surely this is meant hyperbolically. Not burying an abandoned corpse in its place is certainly not equal to murder. But in a pedagogic sense, the teachers have found a way to make their point. Akiva reflects on what had happened, and in a moment that recalls his application of the Talmudic principle of how much the more so, Kal Vachomer, during the story we discussed in Chapter 2. Akiva comes to the conclusion that he was fortunate that he made his mistake while he was trying to do something good. If he had been doing something less noble and made such a mistake, he certainly would have sinned. From this time forward, he vows to serve the sages so that he can avoid future misdeeds. But what, in fact, has he learned? And why would serving the sages help him avoid such errors in the future? First, he has encountered a challenge that forces him to consider what is the nature of the right way to live. Does he just ignore this body and not trouble himself about it? Or does he try to do what is moral, inconvenient though it may be? Akiva's first instinct when he comes upon the abandoned body was to rely on two principles: his innate sense of moral behavior and his understanding of the rules of the then evolving Jewish tradition. This is the way I see most Noahides trying to function. A sense of moral behavior, which often they brought over from their former religion before embracing Noahide. Or what their limited understanding of the Jewish evolving tradition. At the most basic level, Akiva understood that taking care of this body, and it's interesting that the Hebrew word used in the text for carrying the body, nitpalti, to the cemetery literally means I took care of the remains, meant that he could not leave it lying unburied on the road, as the Jerusalem Talmud version describes the location. He understood in his deepest humanity that he needed to bury the body, and he understood as well that Jewish tradition deeply valued honoring the dead. To leave the body unburied would be an affront both to his inner moral being and to his understanding of Jewish principles. That's, a rationalization to a degree. I mean, that's how most people function with the rationalizations. Made sense to me. But this is where the particulars of Judaism, in the exploring of what is the right way, go beyond that sense of, what just seems right. But he learns from the consequences of the story that having an innate moral sensibility and a concept of Jewish ideals is not sufficient to fulfill his role as rabbi and sage. Taking the body to a cemetery seemed like precisely the right response, but he had not counted upon the subtleties and complications of Jewish law. In this case, another principle held precedence, burying the body where it lay. This is his first education in a hard concept. Jewish practice may not always conform to one's understanding of the right thing. That was what I was trying to get across. Jewish tradition is about a discipline, the hard won, hammered out, hotly debated practices that are the essential of halakha law, or in its literal meaning, the Jewish path. And that's what mishpatim are, code of conduct hammered out in the formation of the Talmud. Understanding how it's hammered out and why it's they arrived at that decision. Whoa. For a person as intellectually able as Akiva, this is both a challenge and an immense opportunity. He cannot rely on guesswork and instinct. He needs to join the conversation, the give and take of what comes to be known as Talmudic inquiry. It is an opportunity because the channeling of his innate intelligence to the world, into the world of that community of debate, will be the perfect realization of his talents. In that arena, in time, he will become a master. I think the whole point of Akiva's life is that it provoked the notion of debate that became the Talmud, the reasons behind debate. And like I was saying earlier, wholeness of heart before God is the only thing he recognizes. And when there is a divided heart, you know what, let me pull that verse up. I want to make sure I'm quoting it properly. I think it's Hosea. Chapter 10, and I'm thinking verse 2, and let's see what Rashi has to say on it. Okay, so Hosea 10 verse 2, their heart has parted, now they shall be desolate, that shall demolish their altars, plunder their pillars. Now, when Rashi says their heart has parted from me, now they shall be desolate, that is, the thing that shall demolish their altars, it will destroy them. This is the expression similar from Deuteronomy 21:4, and they shall behead. Exodus 13:13, and you shall behead it. The way Rabbi Nachman describes it from the sages is that you must know what to answer the heretic, and the heretic to him was the dispute that is actually going on in the heart. And so when somebody has a heresy in their understanding, it causes this dispute within the heart, and that heart dispute causes yourself to be desolate, right? Is what Hosea 2, their heart is parted or divided. Now they shall be desolate. And so, a lot of desolation in life that happens is usually because of a misunderstanding of terms, or that we're actually putting into function into this world and causing a wake of disaster in some way, shape, or form. And unless you have pure speech, this is where when the rabbis talk about during the time of Mashiach, where God will give the languages or give the nations a pure speech. What that means, that pure speech is from wholeness of heart rather than twisted definitions. And if you've ever been involved in arguments or debates, it's always based on somebody's understanding of a definition, and it's usually a misunderstanding and of a definition. This means that, and it doesn't in reality, and that causes a person to function incorrectly. So, that was Hosea chapter 10, verse 2. Their heart is divided. Now they shall be desolate. That shall demolish their altars, plunder their pillars. It's like what they stand on and what they're held up by, and what they hold in high regard is a dispute within their heart from the dark side, and they don't see it for what it is. But the rabbis have understood it as a divided heart, and it's something that needs to be straightened out. And I think the rabbis learned a lot from Rabbi Akiva to function in settling these sort of behavior. But there is another outcome from this experience, something that also changes his life. This was the beginning of my service to the sages. The concept of serving the sages, Shimush Talmidei Hakamim, sometimes translated as ministering to the sages or attending to the sages, is a powerful principle in rabbinic literature. The basic idea is that learning Torah requires becoming embedded in the Torah life. You can't just have the certificate because you mentally went through it. It actually has to be a part of you. To study books and ideas in the classroom is not sufficient. One must model one's behavior after the lives of the masters. You will learn from being near sages by watching their ways and modeling your life after those behaviors. But when people misunderstand terms and definitions, you end up, spreading distortion. And this is why certain people should never be teachers. If they're serving themselves, or they have a wicked, crooked path, or definitions in their heart. The Talmud points out the importance of serving the sages in a number of passages, emphasizes the idea that there are things that one cannot learn in books, but only from living exemplars. Rabbi Akiva tells an extreme example of this in another Talmudic passage. I once followed Rabbi Joshua, Akiva relates, into the outhouse. And he learned from how Joshua conducted himself there in Barakot Blessing 62a. Akiva's student, Ben Azai, is shocked and asks, "How did you dare do such a thing with your master?" Akiva calmly responds, "It was a matter of Torah and I needed to learn." This is a far cry from learning about burying an abandoned corpse. But the text does not tell us that Rabbi Joshua protested Akiva's behavior. It appears that he understood Akiva's motivation and supported it. Indeed, the passage shows how this practice of learning from the deeds of one's teachers, even in such matters as behavior in and out house. Oh, forgive me, folks. Just a common cold, but it's one of those ones that just, I'm at that stage. Yeah. Even in such matters as being in an outhouse, is a lesson communicated well by Akiva. We are told immediately afterwards that Ben Azai told his student that he once followed Akiva into an outhouse. When asked the same question, how did you dare? Ben Azai repeats his rabbi's same words. It was a matter of Torah, and I needed to learn. Are there no limits to learning from the rabbi's deeds? Perhaps there are. Our Talmudic text relates to a story immediately afterwards about Rav Kana sneaking into his master's bedroom and hiding under the bed while the rabbi and his wife were making love. When his teacher discovered him there, the master told him to leave, saying, "This is not how people are supposed to behave." Kahana tried out the same mantra. It was a matter of Torah, and I needed to learn. We do not need to hear the master's reply, but one imagines he was not pleased. Indeed, it is possible that the story is meant to be harmonious parody of the tales of Akiva and Ben Azai following their teachers into an outhouse. The point being, true conduct doesn't cross certain lines. What is intimate on somebody's life is between them and God, and even if they're doing something incorrect, you don't need to follow them in their perverted intimate ways to be able to correct or help them if they're not looking to get out of what they're functioning in. What's intimate, out of bounds. But if you're discussing some matters and there's dispute, it's a different story. No matter how we view these particular tales, there is no doubt that serving the sages is a lesson Akiva learned in the case of the abandoned body. Couldn't he have learned how to act upon finding an abandoned body simply by studying the relevant texts or participating in the discussions with the circle of sages? Yes, of course he could have. But Akiva's response to being rebuked was not to say, I should have learned that lesson in class. Rather, he goes in a different direction. I need to watch Torah as it is embodied by these teachers. This is not our modern idea of academic study, where we aim to learn a subject from those who teach us, rather than find them as a role model for our lives. But in Akiva's world, that would not have been possible. This was not a mere academic endeavor that he was engaged in. It was a mastering a way of thinking and a way of living his life. When he says, from that moment on, I always continued to serve the sages, he is choosing a way of being that will influence his future both as a student and a teacher himself as he gains followers over the years. So the story of Akiva and the abandoned body marks the beginning of two dimensions in his life, an immersion into the depths of Jewish law and practice, and a commitment to a life of lived Torah. Akiva looks back on his early years serving the sages, but his relationship with Joshua ben Hanina and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, his own teachers, the ones who presumably he was serving, was anything but simple. As we saw in chapter 2, in the version of his early life told in a vote to Rabbi Nathan, Akiva, like the stonecutter chipping away at a mountain, is portrayed as uprooting and overturning their teachings. Of the two teachers, Akiva appears to have had a much more difficult time with Rabbi Eliezer. In chapter 2, I suggested... I'm out of Kleenex. Got one left. Of the two teachers, Akiva appears to have had much more difficult time with Rabbi Eliezer. In chapter 2, I suggested that the placement of Akiva and Eliezer's origin stories side by side in a vote to Rabbi Nathan sets up an almost structural tension between the two. At the same time, Joshua and Akiva seem more closely allied. Disagreements among the rabbis did not always go smoothly. Rabbinic culture presents a world dominated by the relationships among masters and disciples, teachers and students. But contrary to what we might expect, much as there is respect and reverence for the masters in that world, there is also a dominant theme of dispute and even confrontation between teacher and student, among students themselves. The master has status and power, but even the lowliest student can challenge the master and best him by the power of the disciple's argument. One reason that Akiva represents the very embodiment of the rabbinical world is that he is at the center of this world of debate and disputation. The relationship between Akiva and Eliezer ben Hakanas highlights the complexities of these connections. The Midrashic text Song of Songs Rabbah relates the following story. One day, Rabbi Akiva came late to the Bet Midrash, and he sat outdoors. A question was asked about a particular matter. Is this the law? They said, the law is outside. Again, a question arose, and they said, the Torah is outside. Again, the question arose, and they said, Akiva is outside. Make room for him. He came and sat at the feet of Rabbi Eliezer. As I described in chapter 1, most scholars today believe that the institution of the Bet Midrash, which may look in this story like a formal academy, did not yet exist in Akiva's lifetime. And it appeared that Song of Songs Rabbah projects back in time the institution that later became the center of rabbinic society. That being said, the actual historical context does not affect the thrust of the story. It seems that Akiva, like a college student who has overslept his morning class, chose to sit outside because the session had already begun, trying to be proper etiquette. But perhaps there is something else going on as well. Could it be that Akiva chooses not to interrupt specifically because it is Rabbi Eliezer who is teaching? Indeed, one is tempted to put the story together with a remarkable moment reported in the Jerusalem Talmud. There we read of a debate between Eliezer and Akiva about the issue of whether Sabbath restrictions can be overridden to allow for preparing the special sacrifice done on Passover. Akiva disagrees with Eliezer's position and wins the debate. Then the text adds the following details. For 13 years, Rabbi Akiva would come before Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer did not pay any attention to him. And this statement about Sabbath restrictions and the Paschal sacrifice by Akiva comprised the opening of his first response before Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Joshua, applying a biblical verse in appreciation of Akiva, said to Rabbi Eliezer, "There is the army you sneered at. Now go out and fight it." From Judges 9:38. That's from Pesachim, Passover 6:3. We learn from this story that Rabbi Eliezer essentially ignored Akiva for a period of years. Of course, we should take the 13 years as a poetic hyperbole, but the point is clear. For whatever reason, Eliezer paid no attention to Akiva until the moment in which Akiva outdid him in a rabbinical argument. Rabbi Joshua's clever use of the verse from Judges sums it up well. You didn't pay him any heed, and now he has come and defeated you. Once again, it is the relationship with Joshua that seems to be close one for Akiva. If we circle back to the story of Akiva standing outside after coming late to class, we can understand his hesitancy at entering the room. His relationship with Eliezer was problematic, and interrupting that particular teacher in the middle of his discourse might well have seemed impossible to Akiva. While Eliezer may have ignored Akiva, Akiva's fellow students had come to understand the power of his intelligence and insight. In our story, structured in the three-part model of a good moral tale or a classic joke, first a question of law is asked. We don't know who asks the question, but I think it's fair to assume that it comes from the teacher, Rabbi Eliezer. The students can't answer the question, but say instead, the law is outside. Second, another kind of question is asked. One assumes from the students' response that in this case it is a matter of non-legal interpretation of Torah. The Torah is outside, they all say. Finally, a third question is asked, and the students respond, Akiva is outside. Make room for him. Of course, the answer in each of the three parts of the story is the same. Akiva. The law is Akiva, and the Torah is Akiva. The answer is Akiva. Note that they don't say Akiva knows the answer. They say Akiva is the answer. Why should we be worrying about these questions? The students seem to be saying when the very embodiment of the answer stands outside. Rabbi Eliezer cannot be pleased. Yet Akiva comes in and sat at the feet of Rabbi Eliezer. This gesture reminds us of Rachel kissing Akiva's feet, and upon his return home in Kalba Suvua, making the same gesture. Here Akiva sits at Eliezer's feet, but we are left to wonder whether it is a gesture of respect or perhaps one of resigned submission. The tension between Eliezer and Akiva's teacher and student appears in a variety of places in rabbinic literature. In the tractate on Passover in the Babylonian Talmud, The discussion of the rules governing the Passover sacrifice and the restrictions of the Sabbath are debated in a fashion similar to what we saw above in the passage from the Jerusalem Talmud. But in the midst of this debate, a strange interchange happens. Akiva has outwitted Eliezer in the discussion, and Eliezer turns to him with these ominous words. Akiva, you have refuted me in the discussion about the ritual slaughter of sacrifices. By slaughter shall be his death, from Peshahem 69a. The switch from second person address, you have refuted me, to third person, his death, makes it seem that in the second half of his words, Eliezer is not so much speaking to Akiva as he is making a public prediction about Akiva's violent death. Something, of course, that will occur. In other words, it sounds a good deal more like a curse than a point made by a conversant in a dialogue. This interpretation is supported, I believe, by the way Akiva reacts to Eliezer's words, saying in essence, don't be angry with me. I'm only repeating a teaching I learned from you. In typical fashion, the Talmud goes on to have another rabbi try to show that in fact Eliezer and Akiva were really not disagreeing with one another in point of law, but rather each of them was speaking about a different specific case and not a general principle. It feels like an unconvincing attempt to minimize the conflict between the two disputants. But soon after, in the same discussion, a more interesting interpretation of the differences between Eliezer and Akiva is raised. Since Rabbi Eliezer himself had taught it to Rabbi Akiva, what is the reason that Rabbi Eliezer took the opposite position in this argument? That is, why is Eliezer disagreeing with his own view? Well, I'm out of Kleenexes, so if I get another sneeze coming, I'm going to have to close it down. Which was simply repeated back to him by Akiva. The Talmud then answers its own questions. Rabbi Eliezer had forgotten his own tradition, and Rabbi Akiva came to remind him of that tradition. In that case, the anonymous editorial voice of the Talmud asks, why didn't Akiva tell Eliezer directly that he was only quoting Eliezer's own tradition? The answer, Rabbi Akiva thought that it would not be proper behavior to point out to the Rabbi Eliezer. A good deal of ambiguity resides in this short passage. Is it really possible that Eliezer had forgotten his own previous position on the matter being debated? And if so, as Akiva himself seems to be arguing, perhaps this passage is meant to emphasize Eliezer's weakness, his faltering memory, in contrast to his brilliant and combative student Akiva. As we have seen, one theme that repeats itself in the stories about Akiva and Eliezer is the changing tide of intellectual and moral authority within the burgeoning rabbinic world. Akiva is becoming the dominant voice. Immediately before the passage in Jerusalem Talmud quoted above, Eliezer uses a classic rabbinical style of argumentation to win a point in his dispute over the law with Akiva. But Akiva takes the very same argument and says back to Eliezer, one could take your words and use them to make exactly the opposite point. Eliezer is incensed. Akiva, he says, you are uprooting the Torah, and yet, as the Mishnah tells us, the law follows Akiva's ruling. The student does uproot the teacher. When our story says that Akiva keeps quiet out of politeness or a sense of what is good behavior, I am not convinced. More plausible is a reading of the story as it appears on the page. Akiva is perfectly happy to take on his teacher and repay 13 years of being ignored with a winning attack that actually quotes Eliezer back at himself. The world of the rabbis has its cruelties. One further story about the tension between Eliezer and Akiva may offer us a different angle. In the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Ta'anit, Fast Days, we read a tale in which the issue is a matter of life and death. What can be done to overcome a drought? In the ancient world, particularly in the Middle East, rainfall was a crucial factor in the day-to-day lives of the community. Fasts were proclaimed to try to influence divine favor, and special prayers were offered. Once it happened during a drought that Rabbi Eliezer stood before the congregation and recited the 24 special prayers for a fast day. His prayer was not answered. Rabbi Akiva stood before the congregation after him and prayed, "Our Father, our King, we have no king but you. Our Father, our King, for your sake have mercy upon us," and rains fell. The rabbis murmured about Rabbi Eliezer, at which point a heavenly voice was heard saying, "It is not because this man is greater than that man that caused one prayer to be answered and the others not. Rather, it is because this man, Rabbi Akiva, is a forgiving person and the other is not." In other words, God will show mercy on whom he will show mercy, and on whom he will harden. The rabbis murmured. This is a way of saying that they gossiped about the lack of divine favor shown to Rabbi Eliezer. His star is fading, but a voice from heaven offers an alternative view, telling them that the different results from the two prayers reflect the different personnel qualities of the two rabbis. Akiva is forgiving, Eliezer is not. What does the text mean by a forgiving person? Perhaps the intention here is to mean being forgiving of other people's foibles, not retaliating for wrongdoings, for wrongs that have been done to you. In one case, in the Talmud, the same Hebrew phrase is used in the context of not holding a grudge. Have you ever known people that are like that? Never let anything go? In several other places, one rabbi is quoted as saying that a person who has the quality of forgiving alone is in turn forgiven for all his sins on Yom Kippur. To be forgiving is to forget past insults and hurts. Is that what Rabbi Eliezer is lacking? Is that the quality that Akiva has? Akiva can be tough-minded. He can hold unbending opinions, but the quality of letting go, of forgiving the past, may be what separates him from Rabbi Eliezer. At least, that is the heavenly judgment in the text from Tractate Ta'anit, when it explains why Akiva's prayer is answered while Eliezer's is not. And it is this quality of not forgiving old insults that we will see in the sad, indeed tragic, conclusion of Eliezer's story. Perhaps also Akiva's forgiving nature is one reason that his colleagues hold him in such high regard. Yes, he is the star of the classroom. He is the Torah itself sitting outside the room waiting to be invited in. But he is also sensitive to the needs of his community. Alongside his brilliance, he has an extraordinary spiritual nature as well. We will see this in more detail when we look at the mystical side of Akiva in chapter 6. But as one small example, consider the following story of the way that Akiva bridges his exceptionalism with the demands of the community. Our rabbis taught when a person prays, he should direct his heart towards heaven. It has been taught such was the custom of Rabbi Akiva when he prayed with the congregation. He used to shorten his prayers in order to not be a burden on the congregation. But when he prayed by himself, a person would leave Akiva standing in one corner and find him later in another corner, because of how much he bowed and moved during prayer. This text comes in the midst of an extended Talmudic discussion about the meaning and importance of intentionality and focus during prayer and the performance of the commandments, a concept known as kavanah in Hebrew, literally direction. Akiva is an example of a person who has attained an extraordinary degree of kavanah in his devotional life. He is so focused that he does not even realize how he has moved from one side of the room to the other while he has been directing his heart towards heaven. But this story serves another purpose as well. Akiva is a man who has an equally deep concern for his community. Despite the fact that he outstrips them in the concentration he brings to prayer, he nonetheless cuts his own prayers short when he is praying with others so as not to inconvenience them and, I think, not embarrass them by outdoing them in prayer. In other words, despite the brilliance that he shows in intellectual debate, there is a deep modesty in Akiva that accompanies his special gifts. But Akiva's modesty and connection to his fellows are not limited to the realm of the spiritual, as we see in the following text from the early Midrashic text, Sifrei Deuteronomy. Rabbi Tarfon said, I swear by the temple service, I wonder if there is anyone in this generation who is able to give rebuke to another. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah said, I swear by the temple service, I wonder if there is anyone in this generation who is able to receive rebuke from another. Rabbi Akiva said, I swear by the temple service, I wonder if there is anyone in this generation who knows how one should give rebuke to another. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, I call heaven and earth to witness for me that Rabbi Akiva was rebuked because of me more than 5 times before Rabban Gamaliel in Yavne. I used to complain about Akiva, and Rabban Gamaliel would rebuke him. But I truly know that each time Akiva was rebuked, he loved me more and more. For it says in Scripture, do not rebuke a scoffer, for he will hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you. It's good advice. One of the most interesting ethical questions that rabbinical literature deals with is the importance of rebuking your neighbor when you believe a wrong has been done, either you personally or the community as a whole. This concept of rebuke has its origins in the Bible itself. In fact, the principle is announced preceding one of the most recognizable lines in the entire Bible, indeed all of Western culture. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor, but bear no sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord, from Leviticus 19, verse 17 and 18. These few sentences, appearing in 2 verses in the Hebrew Bible, have occasioned centuries of debate and discussion. What is the relationship between the love your neighbor part and that which goes before it? What does rebuking without bearing sin mean? A very good question. Hang on, folks. I'll be right back. Yeah, sorry about that. I ran out of Kleenexes, and so I had to go get some TP, and let's see if I can finish this chapter. Oh. All right. Yeah, what does rebuking without bearing sin mean? In the story from Sifrei Deuteronomy, we have 4 characters. First, Rabbi Tarfon argues that as important as rebuke is, we live in a time when it is highly unlikely for anyone to actually rebuke another. The text here is somewhat opaque about what that might be the case, but parallel versions of the discussion in the Babylonian Talmud make it clear. If you rebuke someone else, the other person is very likely to reply with an even greater rebuke to you. Second, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah suggests that the real problem is that no one knows how to receive rebuke. Rather than lashing out, as the Talmud describes it, or getting defensive and argumentative, no one knows how to listen to rebuke, accept it, and learn from it. Third, Akiva adds a different perspective. The real problem, he suggests, is that no one understands the best way to rebuke another person. If the person doing the rebuking understood how to rebuke, rebuke would be more easily accepted by the other. Well, thanks, Ashley, for your understanding, but I'd like to finish a chapter so that next time we start on another, right on a chapter. If the person doing the rebuking understood how to rebuke, rebuke would be more easily accepted by the other. Here's another example of the pattern in a discussion in which three opinions are voiced, with Rabbi Akiva being the final one in the group. This seems to suggest that his idea is the answer we should embrace. Of course, it's perfectly reasonable in this case to argue that the debate articulates three equal viable responses to the problematics of rebuke. Each has its own validity, but the notion that the answer rests with Akiva is strengthened here by the coda to our story, the rather striking remarks of the fourth character in our drama, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Yochanan gives us another glimpse into the world of rabbinic debate. It appears, according to the story, that Yochanan used to complain to Rabbi Gamaliel about Akiva, and this led to Akiva being rebuked by his teacher. Rabbi Yochanan adds, each time Akiva was rebuked, he loved me more and more. Why was that so? Yochanan brings a proof text from Proverbs in which we learn that the wise person who is criticized learns from that criticism and sees it as an occasion for self-improvement. The story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri leaves out some important details. What was it about Akiva that led Yochanan to complain to Rabbi Gamaliel when the two of them were Gamaliel's students? We are given no clue, but it is not hard to imagine that the intellectual star quality of Akiva may have made him a difficult colleague in the class. I find, unhealthy competition between some people, it just causes people to be complainers. They just, nobody wants to be outclassed. Everybody wants their starlight to shine. But clearly what Akiva did have was the quality of wisdom extolled by Proverbs. Akiva was able to learn from his mistakes, and in the story, once again, we see those two attractive aspects of his character. It is Akiva who worries about the right way to critique another with sensitivity. And it is Akiva who knows how to accept rebuke. He doesn't lash out at Yochanan. Instead, his love for Yochanan grows, not despite the complaints and criticism, but because of them. Akiva understood what it meant to grow through difficult experiences. Indeed, Yochanan ben Nuri's comment encourages us to recall the rebuke Akiva received from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua about carrying the dead body for burial. There we saw Akiva's reaction to the rebuke. He didn't sulk. He didn't react in anger. Instead, he took upon himself the best path to his own development, namely serving the sages, and through that he became a sage himself. One final word about Akiva and his teachers. A Midrashic text reports the following reflections of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Joshua, and Rabbi Akiva about the nature of learning Torah. Rabbi Eliezer said, if all the seas were ink, and all the reeds were pens, and the heaven and earth were scrolls, and all human beings were scribes, they would not suffice to write all the Torah that I have learned, and yet I took no more from it than a man would take by dipping the point of a paintbrush into the sea. Rabbi Joshua said, if all the seas were ink and all the reeds were pens, and the heaven and earth were writing sheets, and all human beings were scribes, they would not suffice to write all the words of Torah that I have learned, and yet I took no more from it than a man would take by dipping the point of a paintbrush into the sea. Rabbi Akiva said, I am not able to say what my two masters have said, for in fact my masters did take something from their study of Torah, while I have taken no more than one who smells a citron, he who smells enjoys it, while nothing is taken away from the citron. Or I am like one who fills a pitcher from flowing water, or one who lights one lamp from another. In virtually the same words, Akiva's two main teachers speak about what they have learned from the Torah and how much of Torah still remained untapped. One could not possibly write down all that one learned, Both of them say, and yet in the great scheme of things, they are like one who dips the very tip of a paintbrush into the sea, extracting hardly a drop of its water. Eliezer and Joshua are not boasting about how much they have learned. Rather, they are overwhelmed by how much of Torah is still left to be explored. And you're dealing with the infinite nature of Hashem. It just, Akiva's words are at once an expression of his modesty and his admiration for his two teachers. As much as we have seen his complicated and often contested relationship with Rabbi Eliezer, less so with Rabbi Joshua, the text here shows his appreciation for how much he has learned from both men. Is this only a show of modesty? Does Akiva really believe that while they have managed to extract something from Torah, he has not even touched its surface? Akiva uses three metaphors to express his idea. He is like a person who has smelled a fragrant fruit, the citron, etrog in Hebrew, the fruit that is part of the ritual associated with the fall harvest. It's like a lemon smell. He is like a person who fills a pitcher from a powerful stream of water, and he is like one who lights a lamp from another lamp. In each case, the action of the person involved do not in any way diminish the object. The citron, the stream, the lamp all remain as they were. Do Eliezer and Joshua believe that they have lessened Torah? I don't think that is their intention, but they have taken something from it. The bigger question for our purpose is, what does Akiva really think about his accomplishments in relation to his two masters? Certainly, throughout the stories about his life, we see both sides of him. He is a man with enormous self-confidence, and yet at the same time a person of great humility. From these words alone, we cannot really know what he is thinking. And yet, perhaps, beneath the surface, something is being communicated to us. Not so much by Akiva's words, but by the ancient editors of Songs of Rabbi. Those editors placed the text quoted above immediately before the story we looked at earlier about Akiva sitting outside the classroom and eventually being called into the room to address the question the other students could not answer. Why would the editors have made this choice? It is, I believe, the editor's response to Akiva's statement of modesty. Yes, he may have seen himself as merely smelling the fragrance of the etrog, but we say the editors know better. Akiva is the representative of Torah learning at its highest. So his fellow students understand it, and so eventually will the rest of the Jewish world. The rise of Akiva may be the story that we are seeing here, but it certainly does not mean that he wins every argument. In fact, such an outcome would fly in the face of rabbinic culture. Hi, Cookie. In that culture, some were teachers and some were students. There were masters and disciples, but this was a society in which all the rabbis were constantly being both students and teachers at the same time. It was an intellectual meritocracy, despite some obvious complicating differences in social and financial status. There was no course of study, no curriculum in the modern sense of the word, that one followed to become a rabbi. Very important. There was no graduation ceremony with caps and gowns. Because of that, and because, as I have said, we do not have clear chronological biographies with rabbinic literature, we can only surmise that at some point Akiva stopped serving the sages and became one himself. Nonetheless, the rest of his life was bound up with those same figures who were his teachers, colleagues, and students. It appears that the rabbis traveled a good deal from place to place, but at least some of them became associated with one particular locality above others. For example, Rabbi Gamaliel with Yavne and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus with Lod. Akiva is connected with the city Bnei Barak, not far from Jaffa, although the evidence for his settling there is not as robust as one might have thought. The Babylonian Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin Law Court 32b includes a short list of the places where various rabbis settled, and Akiva is said to have gone to Bnei Barak. And most famously, there is the story that appears early in the annual Passover Seder that tells about the all-night discussion of the Exodus from Egypt, a conversation that took place in Bnei Barak among Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, and Rabbi Tarfon. These rabbis were so involved in their discussion that it continued until sunrise, and they had to be interrupted by their students so they could proceed to the morning prayers before it got too late. So it was, I guess, a renowned discussion that they went on and on and on and on and on and on, and time got away on them all, and then they had responsibilities. Yet, despite the association of Akiva with Bnei Barak, it is clear from our sources that there was an almost constant interchange in geographical movement among the small group of sages. How accurate this is historically, of course, we have no way of knowing, but in the way of the stories, the way the stories are told, we see all these rabbis engaged in ongoing debate, disagreement, and intellectual conflict. Indeed, this was a culture in which conflict was likely to be a constant companion. Some of the most monumental crises and struggles in the early stages of Judaism involved Akiva and his peers, and at the same time, it was a tightly knit society of enormous support, vision, and spiritual power. We now turn to stories about this community of scholars. Interesting. All right, so we made it to the next chapter, and I think that's probably the greatest place to stop for today. I do appreciate the prayer for Refuah Shlema, and I'm going to try and get some rest, but I've had guests here from out of province all weekend, and I got to pick them up shortly from the resort and take them to the airport, and then hopefully I can get some much-needed rest for the rest of the day. I've got to start getting lots of fluids and just coping with it. Hopefully I can get over it in a few days, but Hashem willing, we will be back tomorrow with Chapter 5. Hopefully I won't be running as bad and be clearer, but I do appreciate the opportunity to share this with you, and it seems to be getting more interesting, and I believe in finishing what I start. If I don't want to drop a book if we don't have to. I was a little sketchy about the book at first with the first day's readings, but it seems it's getting rather interesting and definitely some stuff to learn from. So, yeah, on that note, we'll be back tomorrow, Hashem willing. Same time with more Rabbi Akiva, Sage of the Talmud by Barry W. Holtz. So until then, have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody. Bye for now.